At the glittering charity gala, billionaire Victoria Ashford let her champagne flute shatter against the marble floor. On the neck of a stranger in navy dress, whites curled a silver anchor wrapped in ribbon, one small gap broken into the base of it. She had drawn that design herself. She had buried it with her husband beneath the ocean 10 years ago. Her fingers closed around the officer's wrist, her eyes gone wide and unfocused. "Tell me," she whispered, "why do you have this tattoo?" The champagne glass was still ringing its last broken note against the marble when Victoria realized the entire ballroom had turned to look at her. For a woman who had spent 10 years training every muscle in her face to betray nothing, the lapse was almost more frightening than the tattoo itself. Victoria Ashford did not shatter things. She did not seize strangers by the wrist in front of 300 of the wealthiest people on the eastern seaboard. She was the woman who had taken the grief of losing her husband and forged it coldly and deliberately into Ashford Global, a name that now sat on towers in 9 cities. People in this room measured their own success against her stillness. And here she was, trembling, her hand locked around a Navy officer's forearm as if he might dissolve. The officer did not pull away. That was the first thing that steadied her, the fact that he simply held still and let her look the way a man holds still for a frightened animal. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you should sit down." She did not sit down. She let go of his wrist one finger at a time and made herself breathe. The gala was the kind of event Victoria had learned to move through like weather, a benefit for the families of service members who had died in the line of duty, held every autumn in a hotel ballroom hung with more crystal than conscience. She wrote a check each year. She shook the hands the evening required her to shake. She had come tonight the way she came every year, armored in charcoal silk, her late husband's name a polished ornament she wore rather than a wound she carried. Nathaniel Ashford lost a decade ago. The family had built a clean and beautiful story around him, and Victoria had learned to live inside it the way a person learns to live inside a house where one room stays permanently locked. She had noticed the officer earlier before any of this without knowing she was noticing. A tall man in dress whites out of place among the dinner jackets crouched down near the dessert tables to speak with a small girl who could not have been more than 7. The girl had a stubborn cowlick and a dress whose hem had come untucked from her sash, and the man was fixing it with the clumsy patience of a father who had learned to do a great many things that did not come naturally to him. There was no wife hovering nearby, no second parent, just the two of them folded into their own small world at the edge of the room. Somewhere in the crowd near the doors, a heavy-set man in a dark suit stood with his hands folded and his back very straight, watching the room the way men are paid to watch rooms. A small enameled pin caught the light on his lapel, the kind veterans wore, the kind Victoria's own security people never bothered with. Her eyes slid over him without stopping. She had no reason yet to know the name Harlan Voss, no reason to feel the faint chill that a wiser instinct might have registered. He was simply furniture in a room full of furniture. It was when the officer had leaned down to the child that his collar had shifted. Just an inch. Just enough. The mark that showed against the side of his neck was not a sailor's usual ink. Victoria knew every regulation anchor, every fouled cable and eagle the service stamped onto its men. This was none of those. This was a slender silver anchor bound in a curl of ribbon, and at the very base of it, where the fluke met the shank, there was a small, deliberate gap in the line, a break, a flaw, as if the artist's hand had lifted for half a second and never come back to close it. Victoria had not lifted her hand by accident. She had drawn that gap on purpose, sitting cross-legged on a hotel bed in a city a long way from here, laughing, while a much younger Nathaniel complained that she was ruining a perfectly good anchor. A perfect thing is a stranger's thing, she had told him. This way it's only ours. She had watched the artist ink it into his shoulder the next morning. She had run her thumb over it 1,000 nights since, until the memory of it was the last thing left of him that still felt warm. And it was here, on the throat of a man she had never met in her life. That was the moment the glass had left her hand. Now the noise of the ballroom was flooding back in around her, the murmur turning to concern a waiter already crouching to sweep the broken crystal from the floor. Victoria straightened her spine out of pure reflex and produced the voice that had closed 100 deals. "Forgive me," she said loud enough to release the room. "Clumsy of me. Please go on." The crowd, obedient to money, went on. The little girl was looking up at her father with wide, uncertain eyes. He rested a hand on the top of her head. "Avery," he said gently, "why don't you go find Mrs. Delacroix and tell her I'll be 5 minutes? I'll come get you for dessert, promise." The girl went glancing back twice. When she was gone, the officer turned to Victoria, and for the first time she saw his face fully a lean, weathered face mid-40s, with the kind of quiet in it that is earned rather than born. "You know that design?" he said. It was not a question. "I made that design." Her voice came out lower than she intended. "There is exactly one man on this earth who was supposed to have it, and I put him in the ground 10 years ago. So I'm going to ask you again, and I would like you to understand that I will not be managed or handled or gently walked away from. Why is it on your neck?" Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, she would decide later, but a kind of grief that recognized her own. "Not here," he said. "Please, not in front of all these people. There's a room." The room turned out to be a small private lounge off the main corridor, meant for coat storage and quiet phone calls, smelling of cold coffee and other people's perfume. Victoria pulled the door shut behind them and put her back against it as though she could keep the truth from escaping until she had wrung it dry. "Your name," she said. "Caleb Dawson, Commander, United States Navy." He didn't offer his hand. He seemed to understand that this was not a room for handshakes. "And you're Mrs. Ashford. I know who you are. Everyone in that ballroom knows who you are." He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. "I didn't know the anchor was yours. I want you to hear that first. I've carried it for 10 years, and I never once knew there was a woman it belonged to." "Then tell me where you got it." "From your husband." He said it plainly, and the plainness of it was what made it land. "From watching a man I never learned the full name of give up his life so that I could keep mine." The floor seemed to tilt very slightly beneath her. "That's not possible," she heard herself say. "Nathaniel died in a helicopter accident. There was a report. There was a service, a flag." She was reaching for the polished story, the clean one, the one the family had handed her in the worst week of her life. "He never even reached the water. That's what they told me." "I don't know what they told you." Caleb's voice stayed low and even, but there was iron underneath it now. "I only know what I saw. And what I saw wasn't a helicopter." He told her then in the plain, unhurried way of a man who had told the story only to himself for a decade and had worn every edge of it smooth. It had been a storm off the coast, a real one, the kind that turns the sea into something with a will of its own. A family had been trapped where the cliff road washed out their car, pinned against the rocks with the tide climbing. Caleb had gone down the face on a line, and Nathaniel had gone down after him because one man was not enough, and there had been no time to wait for more. Between the two of them, they had gotten the family up. But the last stretch of rock had given way, and Caleb had felt himself going, his grip failing, the black water waiting below him with its mouth open. "He got a hand on me," Caleb said. "I don't know how. He shouldn't have been able to reach me, but he got a hand on me and he put everything he had left into throwing me up onto the ledge. His jacket tore open across the shoulder when he did it, the whole seam went. And there was a flash of lightning close right on top of us. He touched the side of his own neck unconsciously, the way a man touches an old scar. That's when I saw it. The silver anchor, the ribbon, and that little gap at the bottom like something the artist forgot to finish. I had maybe a second to see it before the next wave came. And then," her voice had gone to almost nothing, "and then he smiled at me, Caleb's jaw worked once. "I'll go to my own grave not understanding it, ma'am," but he smiled like a man who'd finished something he was proud of. "And the sea took him. I never even got his name that night. By the time I was well enough to go looking, the whole thing had been folded up and filed away and sealed, and every door I knocked on came back empty." Victoria stood with her back against the door and felt the locked room inside her, the one she had lived beside for 10 years, crack open along a seam she had never known was there. He had not died strapped into a machine. He had died reaching for a stranger with his last strength, and he had smiled doing it. There was a terrible pride in that, a pride so large and so bright that for one breath it filled her chest and lifted her the way the thought of him used to before grief had ground the shine off it. Her husband had been exactly the man she'd married, better even, a hero with a witness who had carried his mark for 10 years like a debt. And underneath the pride, so fast she almost missed it, came the first thin thread of something colder. Because if this was true, if any of this was true, then the story she had been handed the helicopter, the clean official grief she had built her whole armored life around, was not the truth at all. Then what exactly had she spent 10 years believing? She did not let herself follow the thought. Not yet. It was too large and too new, and it had teeth she wasn't ready to feel. She pressed it back down and held on to the one thing she could stand to hold. "You copied it," she said. "The tattoo. You put it on yourself." "I did." He didn't look away from her. "Same shoulder line, same ribbon, same broken gap at the base. I found the best artist I could, and I made him match it exactly right down to the flaw. I told myself a man ought to carry the price of his own life somewhere he'd see it every morning." A muscle moved in his cheek. "I never knew the flaw meant something. I thought he just had a bad tattoo artist. I didn't know a woman drew it that way on purpose." Victoria closed her eyes. When she had walked into that ballroom tonight, she had been a widow with a finished story, a woman who had made her peace by refusing to disturb the grave. She understood, standing in that small, cold room that smelled of coffee and stranger's perfume, that the peace had been a lie, and that she now had a choice that could not be unmade. She could walk back out there. She could let the broken glass be a broken glass, let Commander Dawson be a stranger with a coincidence inked on his neck, and keep the beautiful, clean story the family had built. It would cost her nothing. It would let her sleep. Or she could pull the thread and let it unravel whatever it was going to unravel and go looking for the truth about the man who had smiled at the sea. She opened her eyes. "Commander Dawson," she said, and her voice had found its steel again, though something new burned underneath it now. "I don't sleep well anyway. Tell me everything you remember. From the beginning." Life sometimes pushes us toward the soft, easy lies, the ones that let us rest. But the truth, however cruel or ragged, is the only ground solid enough for a soul to truly heal and walk on in peace. The truth, once Victoria decided to pull the thread, did not come loose the way she expected. It did not spill. It resisted the way things resist that someone has taken great care to not shut. She began where she always began, with paper. Ashford Global insured its senior people the way it insured its buildings, with policies so large they had their own filing rooms and their own lawyers. In the days after the gala, she had one of those files pulled the corporate life insurance carried on Nathaniel a decade ago, and she read it alone at 3 in the morning at the long table in her study, the way she had once read prospectuses before deciding whether a company lived or died. It took her 4 passes to find the sentence that mattered because it had been written to be missed. The policy paid out, and it was a staggering sum, the kind of number that could seat a whole division, but only under a specific condition. The death had to occur, the clause read, in the course of an approved operational duty. Any voluntary act of exceptional risk outside the scope of assigned duty voided the coverage entirely. There was even a phrase for it tucked in among the definitions, cold as a scalpel unsanctioned hazard. Victoria set the page down very carefully, as if it might cut her. A man who died strapped into a helicopter on an approved flight was worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the people who held that policy. A man who threw himself down a storm-lashed cliff to save strangers he had never met, a man who chose freely to be a hero, was worth nothing at all. The clause did not merely fail to reward what Nathaniel had done, it punished it. It turned the finest act of his life into a breach of contract. And someone had understood that 10 years ago with perfect clarity. She had assumed without ever examining the assumption that she had handled Nathaniel's death herself. She had not. She saw that now with a sick, dawning precision. In that first unspeakable week, she had been a younger woman with no seat yet at the head of the table, and the head of the table had belonged to Charles, her husband's father, patriarch of the Ashford name, with Gregory, Nathaniel's younger brother, at his right hand. It had been Charles who took the paperwork out of her shaking hands. Charles, who arranged the service, the flag, the sealed casket she had wept over without ever asking why it was sealed. "Let us carry this, Victoria," he had said, folding her hands in his voice like warm oil. "You shouldn't have to look at any of it." And she, drowning, had been grateful. She had let him carry it. She had let him carry all of it for 10 years, and never once wondered what a man might do with something you were too broken to look at. The beneficiary named on the policy was not Victoria Ashford. It was a corporate trust, and the corporate trust answered then as now to Charles, with Gregory holding the second signature on every disbursement it had ever made. She understood then what had been done, and the understanding sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. To collect that fortune, someone had needed Nathaniel's death to be an approved accident rather than an unsanctioned act of courage. So the storm and the cliff and the family on the rocks had been quietly erased, and in their place a helicopter had been written down, clean, sanctioned, tragic, and profitable. And the one person who might have asked the wrong questions, the widow had been wrapped in tender concern and kept a careful arm's length from every original document for her own protection out of love. She thought she had known everything about the worst night of her life. She had known nothing. She had been handed a painting and told it was a window. When she and Caleb tried to go at it directly, when her people filed the requests to unseal the Navy's original rescue file, the real one, the one with the cliff and the tide and the names in it, the doors did not so much close as reveal themselves to have been welded shut long ago. Requests came back, delayed, then delayed again, each refusal signed by an authority that pointed to another authority. And behind all of it, when her investigators finally traced the chain of who had ordered the sealing kept in force, there was a single name doing the work of keeping the past buried. Harlan Voss. She recognized the name only when a photograph landed on her desk, and even then it took her a moment. A heavy-set man, dark suit, back very straight. The small, enameled veteran's pin on the lapel. The man who had stood by the ballroom doors with his hands folded, watching over the room like something more than hired muscle. He had been there that night. She realized Charles's man positioned at the one event where the past might walk up and introduce itself. He had been guarding the seam even then, and she had looked right through him. The paper road ended at Harlan Voss, and Victoria did not have the key to that lock. So she did what she had spent 30 years learning to do when the front entrance was barred. She found another way in. If the family on the cliff had been real, then somewhere there were people who remembered being saved. People the official story had erased along with the storm. It took Caleb's fragments and 2 weeks of quiet, expensive searching, but the family had a name, and the name was Reyes. And the mother who answered the phone in a small house 3 states away was named Sophia. Victoria made the call herself. She had made 10,000 calls in her life calls that moved markets, and none of them had cost her what this one did. She explained who she was carefully, and then she explained why she was calling, and she said the words, "a man with a silver anchor tattoo," into the phone, and waited. The sound that came back down the line was not words at first. It was a sharp intake of breath and then a sob so raw that Victoria had to close her eyes against it. "We have been looking for that man for 10 years, Sophia Reyes said when she could speak. Her voice shook around every syllable. 10 years. My daughter is grown now. She's in college. She's going to be a nurse, and she is only alive because of the things he said to her on that rock while we waited to die. We never knew his name. We prayed for a man with no name for 10 years. She was crying openly now, unashamed. Please, please tell me you found him. Tell me we can finally thank him." Victoria could not answer right away, because if she opened her mouth, she was going to make the same sound Sophia was making, and she had not made that sound in 10 years. It was in that silence, with a stranger weeping gratitude into her ear, that the thing she had refused to feel in the coat room at the gala finally tore loose and split her open. It came apart into 3 separate pains, so distinct she could have named them like children. The first was pride, and it was almost unbearable in its brightness. Her husband had died the best kind of death a man could die, not a random one, not a machine failing over water, but a chosen one, a giving one, the kind that a whole family 3 states away had spent a decade praying to say thank you for. He had been even more than she had loved him for. There was a fierce, aching glory in it that lifted her chest and made her want to say his name aloud to the empty study. The second pain came right behind it and put the first one out like a hand over a candle, because she had not been allowed to know this. For 10 years, she had grieved the wrong death. She had laid flowers on a lie, wept into a story, built an entire iron life on a foundation someone had poured for her out of fiction. Every private ceremony of her mourning, every anniversary she had marked, had been aimed at a man who had never existed, a passenger in a helicopter, while the real man, the one who smiled at the sea, had gone unthanked and unmourned in his truth. They had not only stolen the money, they had stolen her grief. They had taken the one thing that was hers alone and counterfeited it. And the third pain was the coldest of the 3, and it did not flare. It settled. Because the people who had done this to her were not enemies in some rival tower. They were not strangers. They shared her name. They had folded her hands in theirs and told her not to look. Charles had held her while she cried over a sealed casket he knew held a lie. Gregory had stood beside her at the graveside of a story he had helped invent. The betrayal had not come at her from the outside world she had armored herself against. It had come from inside the house, from the family table, from the very name she had turned into an empire, believing it meant something. She did not weep in the end. The grief went down into her and came back up, changed the way iron goes into a fire and comes out as a blade. When she finally spoke to Sophia Reyes again, her voice was steady, and it was the steadiness of a decision fully made. "His name was Nathaniel Ashford," she said. "He was my husband, and I am going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what he did and exactly who tried to bury it. I promise you that. You'll get to thank him properly. I'll see to it myself." The quiet search was over. What she had begun as a widow trying to understand a tattoo, she would finish as something else entirely. Charles had not built the Ashford name by waiting to be attacked. He learned that his daughter-in-law was pulling at sealed files, perhaps from Voss, perhaps from the questions her own people had been asking too loudly, and he struck first the way he always struck, through money and through print. The stories began in the business press, where the Ashfords owned enough advertising to be owed favors. They were written with a surgeon's cruelty. Victoria Ashford, they suggested with wounded concern, was not well. The strain of running the empire alone for a decade had finally told on her. Those close to the family spoke anonymously of erratic behavior of a grieving widow past 60 who had lost her grip on reality. And into this fragile state, the stories went on, had walked a penniless Navy officer with a convenient tattoo, and a young daughter, a man who had, through some combination of flattery and seduction and calculated lies, wormed his way into a lonely woman's confidence with his eye plainly on her fortune. They put it in print. They put the seduction in print, the manipulation, the fortune hunting. And then, because cruelty of that particular kind knows no floor, they reached down and pulled Caleb's daughter into it. A photograph of Avery ran beside one of the articles. A child of 7, her face half turned, used as a prop in a story designed to paint her father as a predator. Overnight, the quiet life Caleb had built for the two of them, the school pickups, the ordinary anonymity, became a thing under a spotlight. Reporters at the edge of the schoolyard, whispers following a little girl who did not understand what she had done wrong. Victoria watched it happen and understood that this was the true shape of the machine she was fighting. It did not merely lie. It found whatever a person loved most and threatened it precisely to make them stop. The call came on a Tuesday evening direct to her private line, the number almost no one had. She knew the voice before he finished the first word. Charles had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a favor he was doing you, Victoria. He said, warm as ever, the warmth that had once undone her in her grief. I think we've both let this go on longer than is dignified. I'm calling because I still care what happens to you, whatever you may believe. You put a photograph of a child in the newspaper, Charles. Her hand was very steady on the phone. Don't speak to me about dignity. I'm going to tell you something, and I'd like you to hear it as the kindness it is. His voice never lost its unhurried ease. There is nothing to find. Whatever that officer told you, whatever you think you've assembled, the original records are gone. Legally destroyed years ago at the end of their retention period. There is no document in existence that says anything other than what the world already believes. And the world, my dear, has just spent a week reading about a confused widow being led by the hand toward the edge of a cliff by a man who wants her money. She could hear the smile in it. One of those things has paper behind it. The other has nothing. Which do you imagine people will choose to believe? He was so certain. That was the thing that lodged in her afterward, standing alone in the dark of her study with the phone gone dead in her hand. He was not bluffing about the originals. She could hear that he believed every word of it. In his mind, the last thread had been cut long ago, and the account was closed. He did not know, could not have imagined that a man he paid to make things disappear had spent a lifetime quietly keeping one copy of everything he was ordered to bury. Charles believed the vault was empty because he had never understood the men who guarded it. But Victoria did not know that yet either. In that moment, she knew only what she could see, and what she could see was ruin. No evidence. Her name being dismantled in print sentence by sentence until even people who liked her would hesitate. Caleb hollowed out, a proud man reduced to shielding his daughter's face from cameras, the accusation against him, half designed to make him let go of Victoria's hand for the child's sake. Every road she had opened was closing again, and this time it was closing over the innocent people she had pulled in with her. She stood in the unlit room where she had first read the clause that priced her husband's courage at nothing, and for the length of one long breath, she felt the whole thing collapse inward, the truth she had found, and could not prove the family, she could not fight the good people she had led into the fire. When evil uses money and power to trade black for white, the strongest weapon a decent person holds is not some greater force of their own. It is the simple refusal to let go of the innocent standing beside them. Charles did not wait for Victoria to recover. A man who has already decided the game is won moves quickly to collect, and so it was that a heavy-set figure in a dark suit appeared one evening at the gates of the modest house where Caleb Dawson was raising his daughter. Harlan Voss came alone, and he came with a check. He held it out through the cool night air, the way a man hands over something he has done many times before and has stopped letting himself feel. The amount had been left blank. That was Charles's particular cruelty, not a number, but an invitation to name one. The terms were simple, and Voss delivered them in a flat voice that gave nothing away. Take the child and go. Leave the city, leave the state, disappear somewhere far enough that the story could not follow. Let Victoria Ashford stand alone and fall alone. Sign yourself out of it, Commander, and the money is whatever you want it to be. Caleb stood on his own front step with the porch light behind him and looked at the blank check for a long moment. The headlights of the car in the drive threw a hard white glare across the two men, and in that glare the silver anchor on Caleb's neck caught the light, the ribbon, and the small broken gap at its base, thrown into sharp relief. He did not take the check. He folded it once along the middle and pressed it back into Harlan Voss's hand. "There are things money doesn't buy," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. Like my daughter growing up and knowing her father wasn't a man who could be bought to walk away from what was right. She's going to know that. That's not for sale. And here the story slows for the length of a single held breath, because a moment like that deserves to be looked at rather than rushed past. A man with nothing was handed everything and gave it back, because there was a line inside him he had decided long ago he would not cross. That is the whole of it. The worth of a person is not measured by what they can be made to accept, but by the one thing they will not do at any price. Caleb Dawson could have named a fortune that night. Instead, he named a boundary, and in doing so, he handed his daughter something no check could ever have covered. What neither man said aloud was that the boundary had been seen. Harlan Voss stood holding the folded check in the glare of his own headlights, and something in his weathered face shifted, some old thing turning over in the dark after a long sleep. He had not always been a man who carried checks to the doors of the decent. Before the suits and the sealed files and the quiet money of powerful men, he had worn a uniform too. He had believed in things once, in a chain of command and a code, until a day came when the men above him needed a scapegoat, and he learned exactly how much his loyalty was worth to people who had more to lose than he did. He had come out of that the way a great many men come out of it, hard and for hire, a man who cleaned up other men's messes and asked no questions, because questions were for people who could still afford them. But a man like that develops habits. And the oldest habit of the professional cleaner, the one that keeps him alive when the powerful decide he has become a mess of his own, is that he never destroys the last copy. Every document he had ever been ordered to bury, he had buried, and then quietly kept a duplicate filed away somewhere only he could reach insurance against the day a Charles Ashford decided a loose end needed tying off. It was not conscience that had made him keep the sealing order with Charles's living signature on it. It had been survival, cold and practical. Standing in his own headlights, watching a Navy man hand back a blank check for the sake of a 7-year-old's opinion of him, Harlan Voss felt the soldier he had buried under 20 years of hire begin against all sense to stir. He came to Victoria 2 days later, and he brought the copy. It was a photostat of the original sealing order, the instruction to lock away the true rescue file, the one with the Storm and the Cliff and the Reyes family in it. And at the bottom, unmistakable, was the living signature of Charles Ashford. Not a lawyer's proxy, not a corporate seal. His own hand dated, ordering the truth buried within days of Nathaniel's death. Victoria held it, and for the first time since the gala, she had something in her hands that could not be waved away as the fantasy of a confused widow. Between this page, Sophia Reyes's testimony, and the one silver anchor design that existed nowhere on earth, but her own memory and 2 men's skin, she had a weapon at last. She had badly underestimated how Charles would answer it. He did not fold. She had half expected him to crumble the moment real paper appeared, and instead he came back harder than before, the way old money comes back when it is finally frightened. His lawyers descended on the sealing order at once. The copy was inadmissible, they argued, obtained improperly stolen property, the fruit of a disgruntled employee's theft. They turned on Harlan Voss with a speed that proved his caution had been justified, all along threatening to see him prosecuted for the very documents that might have redeemed him. And they reached with cold precision for the softest target left standing. They moved to have the pressure applied to Caleb's naval career, to see a decorated officer quietly ushered toward the door. His record clouded, his daughter's father made small. It was Victoria understood a demonstration. Charles was showing her the price of every further step. He could not unmake the copy, so he would make the copy cost more than she was willing to pay. He had misjudged what she was willing to pay. The problem was plain once she stopped flinching from it. A stolen photostat standing alone would never survive Charles's lawyers. On its own, it was exactly the theft they said it was. What it could do, the only thing it could do, was tell her precisely which sealed Navy file to demand and swear on record that a true version of it existed. That turned an impossible request into a specific one. But a court would only compel the government to unseal a decade-old file over the objection of a name like Ashford if the person demanding it could show clean, compelling sworn cause, and the only person who could swear that cause was Victoria herself in the open, under oath, with the whole machinery of her company laid bare to prove she had no motive but the truth. So she gave them the one thing Charles was certain she would never risk. She went to the regulators herself and opened Ashford Global to a full forensic audit, every account and every trust, including the corporate trust that Charles controlled and Gregory co-signed. She submitted to sworn examination, and she accepted as the price of standing before a judge with clean hands a settlement that stripped her of a controlling share of the company her grief had built, trading the empire deliberately for the standing to make one lawful demand. On that footing, and only on that footing, the court ordered the true Navy file unsealed through the front door in the light where Voss's copy was no longer the evidence, but merely the map that had led them to it. When the original file finally opened the real one, the storm and the cliff and the tide and the names it lined up against Harlan Voss's copy and against every word Sophia Reyes had wept into the telephone, and the three of them together closed around Charles like a current he had spent a decade pretending he could outrun. What he had built to hide a fraud became the very machinery that convicted him of it. The clause he had exploited, the death he had rewritten, the fortune he had diverted through a corporate trust that answered only to him. It resolved in the plain language of the state into insurance fraud. Gregory, whose signature sat beside his father's on every disbursement, was named in the same filing and left to answer for it beside him. There was no name and no lawyer large enough to make that word go away. In the end, to keep the last shred of dignity a long life had left him, Charles surrendered. He did not do it graciously. Men like Charles never do. But he did it. He came in person to sign the agreement that returned every dollar of the diverted fortune, all of it directed now into a foundation raised in his own dead son's name. And he offered before witnesses a public apology to Caleb Dawson and to Victoria Stiff, joyless, but spoken aloud where it could not be taken back. There was no ruin of him beyond that, no vengeance dragged out for its own sake. The truth had been enough. Justice, when it finally came, wore the plain face of the facts rather than the red one of revenge, and Victoria found she wanted nothing more than that. She had never been after his blood. She had only ever wanted her husband's death to mean what it had actually meant. The foundation was called the Anchor Hope, and it took as its emblem the silver anchor bound in ribbon, the small broken gap left in at the base, exactly as she had drawn it on a hotel bed a lifetime ago. What had been a private flaw between two lovers became in the end a mark that thousands of grieving single-parent families would come to know as a promise of help. Nathaniel's name went where it belonged at last, not on a lie about a helicopter, but on the truth of a man who went down a cliff in a storm for strangers and smiled as the sea took him. Sophia Reyes came to the opening. Her daughter came too, the young woman who was going to be a nurse, and she stood a long time in front of the anchor on the wall before she could speak, and when she finally did, the thing she said was, "Thank you," 10 years late, to a man who had needed to hear it and never would. Except that somehow through all of them standing there, perhaps he did. Caleb refused every honor anyone tried to hang on him. There were medals offered and interviews and the kind of attention that could have remade his small life into something loud and public, and he wanted none of it. He went on doing the quiet work he had always done, sitting with broken people and helping them carry what could not be set down, a counselor to the grieving who asked for no nameplate. Harlan Voss faded back out of the story, the way such men preferred to, but not the way he had come into it. He left it a man who had once at the very end chosen the harder and truer thing, and that choosing had given him back something 20 years of hire had taken away. And Victoria did not rush toward the thing that a lesser story would have rushed toward. There was no sudden turn from grief to romance, no scene where the widow fell into the arms of the man who had carried her husband's mark. What grew between Victoria and Caleb grew the way real things grow slowly, and mostly in silence over a great many ordinary days. She began appearing at the community sessions where he did his quiet work at first, to help fund them, and then simply to be there. Avery, who had once been a photograph used to wound her father, grew easy around Victoria by degrees until the child would save her a seat without thinking about it. The two adults talked when they talked about the people they had lost and the long, strange labor of surviving them, never about themselves, never in the language of courtship. It was the furthest thing imaginable from the ugly story Charles had printed, and precisely because it was so slow and so guarded, it gave that story the lie. Whatever this was, no one had seduced anyone. It had been built brick by patient brick, on truth and on the shared work of healing, and there was nothing in it that anyone needed to hide. On a bright afternoon in the memorial garden, the foundation had planted with children laughing somewhere off across the grass. Caleb crossed the lawn to where Victoria stood and rested a hand on her shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not need to. There were no declarations, no promises made aloud, only the weight of a hand that had once belonged to a drowning man her husband had saved, resting now on the shoulder of the woman that same husband had loved. The storm was long over. The silver anchor on Caleb's neck was no longer the mark of a blood debt or the emblem of a thing hidden away in the dark. It had become at the last the proof of a new love raised out of the ashes of an old grief carried into the light by the very people the truth had cost the most and given freely back to the world. People tend to think of death as the end of things. But a truly kind act has no expiration. It is like a good arrow loosed into the air, flying on and on through time, joining strangers' souls together, and warming the world long after the hand that released it has gone home to the earth.